Call the meeting to order. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to meeting number 3 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence. Pursuant to the motion adopted on September 16, 2025, the committee is meeting to receive a threat analysis of the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions. Before we continue, I would like to ask all persons participating to consult with the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all our participants, including the interpreters, who will be noticing. You'll have those QR codes on the card, which links to a short awareness video, which I would ask you to look at after our meeting so we can pay full attention to our witnesses. I would like to take a few. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. And for those participating by video conferencing, which there are none, click on the microphones. But for those of us here, also take advantage of the translation for different languages. And a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. And for members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand, and you know the drill. The topic for panel 1 is defense and security in the Euro-Atlantic region. I would now like to welcome our witnesses. From the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Eric Laporte, Executive Director, Defense and Security Relations. And from the Department of National Defense, Major General Robert Riche, Director of Staff, Strategic and Joint Staff, Canadian Armed Forces. And Ty Current, Deputy Director General, International Security Policy. It's my understanding that only officials from D&D will be delivering opening remarks. You have 5 minutes for your statement. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the invitation. We've already gone through the introduction, so I would just say, on behalf of my colleagues here, it's an honor to be here this morning, and we're looking forward to the discussion. The topics of Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific are very relevant, given the priority that was placed on them in our recent defense policy update, Our North Strong and Free. For the
first session, I would like to discuss the fact that at the recent NATO summit in The Hague, we are focused on defense and security as well as that of all of our allies. At the NATO summit, Canada committed to meeting the 2% goal this fiscal year. We are accelerating over $9 billion in investments to rebuild, rearm, and modernize our armed forces.
Better pay and support for personnel, new aircraft and vehicles, advanced sensors for Arctic surveillance, and modernization of our digital infrastructure. Additionally, allies, including Canada, have also made a historic commitment to strengthen our collective defense, including a pledge to reach 5% of GDP in defense spending by 2035. And this 5% has 2 components. First, allies will allocate at least 3.5% of GDP annually to core defense requirements. These are the defense areas that comprise the previous 2% NATO target. Second, the remaining 1.5% of GDP will be invested in strengthening allies' defense industrial base, protecting critical infrastructure, and ensuring civilian preparedness and resilience. Avant le sommet de l'OTAN, le Premier ministre...
Prior to the NATO summit, the Prime Minister also participated in a Canada-EU summit and concluded a security and defense partnership with the EU, which reflects our broader commitment to reinforcing and deepening transatlantic security ties. Our GAC colleagues are now negotiating a follow-on agreement that would allow for Canada's, so a bilateral with the European Union, that would allow for Canada's participation in the Security Action for Europe, or SAFE, as part of our joint efforts to increase defense industrial capacity.
Europe remains a key operational area for the CAF. We continue to lead NATO's land forces in Latvia through Operation Reassurance, our largest overseas mission. During a recent visit to Latvia, the Prime Minister announced an extension of that operation for another 3 years. Le Canada joue un rôle clé dans la
Canada plays a significant role on the eastern flank. In the context of our work as the framework nation for NATO's forward land forces in Latvia, Canada, along with our 13 partners in the multinational brigade, are part of the biggest reinforcement of Alliance collective defense in our generation. To the east, supporting Ukraine is central to our shared security. Canada's military training and capacity building efforts began in 2015 and continue today through Operation Unifier. Since 2015, we've trained over 46,000 Ukrainian troops under Operation Unifier, covering vital areas such as basic and advanced military skills, battlefield tactics, medical training, and combat engineering.
We've seen small Russian progress at significant cost for them, and numerous examples of Ukrainian innovation and the willingness to continue to fight, such as June's Operation Spiderweb, which targeted Russian long-range aviation. My colleagues can provide additional details on the battlefield situation or the status of negotiations if desired. Canada continues to contribute and is working with our allies through the NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine and SATU, and through the Coalition of the Willing to explore substantive security guarantees for Ukraine, an essential step towards a durable peace. In the meantime, though, we're also focused on ensuring that Ukraine has what they need, the funding and equipment needed to continue the fight. Since the full-scale invasion, Canada has pledged nearly $22 billion in aid to Ukraine, including over $6.5 billion in military assistance. This has delivered critical capabilities for the Ukrainians, including armored vehicles, high-tech components, flight simulators for F-16s, and essential things such as winter clothing, all of which have been provided by Canadian suppliers. We're also proud to provide training for F-16 pilots under the Ukraine Defense Contact Group's Air Force Capability Coalition and to contribute to the Armor, Drone, and Information and Technology coalitions. These efforts reflect our enduring commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and to Euro-Atlantic stability. Pour conclure, je tiens à souligner que l'environnement.
In closing my introductory remarks, I'd like to point out that the security environment in Europe remains dynamic and complex. That said, NATO remains strong and ready to defend Allied territory, as seen as recently as last week following the incursion of Russian drones over Polish airspace, while we are working with allies and partners to support U.S. efforts to achieve peace in Ukraine. Russian actions since the August 6 meeting in Alaska.
Importance of defense investments that we're making and the need to work closely with our allies. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Curran. Appreciate the introduction and the ability to get ourselves started. I'm going to pass it over to Cheryl Gallant to lead us off.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through you to the witnesses. First, I'd like to mention that the troops are still waiting for that pay increase that was promised to them on April 1st. So a week ago today, Taiwan Ambassador Harry Tsang hosted a session on maritime security. We learned about the intentional undersea cable cutting in the Baltics, Europe, and Taiwan. How prevalent is the gray zone tactic along Canadian shores, cutting undersea cables?
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Perhaps I'll just zoom out a little bit about gray zone tactics writ large. We can talk through that and then perhaps get into the details about undersea cables. We've seen hybrid threats and gray zone tactics continue and proliferate over the last several years. We think it underlines the importance of defense investments in order to provide deterrence from a military point of view, but we recognize that when faced with challenges militarily, our adversaries will look for other ways to target us. That includes things like cyber, targeting critical infrastructure, threats to democratic resilience. And so it speaks to the need for sort of a whole of society approach in order to counter these threats, but noting as well that our ability to counter them is based on our ability as well to counter military threats, which underlines the importance of these investments.
Okay, so how often have the undersea cable cuttings happened along Canadian land masses?
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair. This is something that, in partnership with other government departments and agencies, the Department of National Defense continues to monitor this.
Beautiful.
There have been incidents in the east coast of Canada, which we are actively monitoring in partnership with allies and partners. And we continue to take proactive and preventative measures for potential for reoccurrence in the future.
Okay, the question was how many as well. In any of these incidents, was there any vessel identified around that time as being close to the path of the undersea cables?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We continue to work with partners. I do not have that information available at this time. That said, I can commit that the integrated intelligence community are lashed up and working both across the Government of Canada in partnership with provinces and territories and Indigenous stakeholders, and importantly, allies in continental defense in terms of surveillance for detection of all domain threats from seafloor to space.
Do Canadian fishing vessels have access to the charts that show the undersea cable routing?
Mr. Chair, that is not my area of expertise. We can coordinate with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard, who are probably in a better position to provide an accurate response to that question.
Well, the Coast Guard and military are being combined, it has been reported. Do the Coast Guard patrols keep an eye on vessels loitering near the undersea cables?
Mr. Chair, pleased to be able to talk about the Canadian Coast Guard. As colleagues know, on the 9th of June, the Prime Minister announced the merger. At this point, there is no plan to militarize the Canadian Coast Guard or incorporate a law enforcement role. I can speak to the fact that they will be additive in the security domain, as well as surveillance, all domain threats, supporting as well search and rescue, icebreaking in the Arctic, as well as in commercial shipping routes. They will contribute to environmental, ocean science, safe navigation, and fisheries enforcement.
All right. If a fishing vessel noticed another vessel, foreign vessel, loitering along the pathway of the undersea cables, would the crew know who to report this to? It's suspicious activity.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Yes. Right now, we have a Canadian Coast Guard that is robust in their procedures, and strengthening sovereignty and maritime domainis is at the core of their mission. We're right now finalizing and professionalizing the integration of the Canadian Coast Guard with the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force to ensure that we provide integrated awareness to be able to cue exploitation or other assets if we see suspicious activity.
Okay, so it sounds like that they should report it to the Coast Guard. Does the Canadian Armed Forces depend on communications routed through undersea cables?
Yes.
Okay, so the answer was yes. I don't know, Mr. Curran, if that was on the record. Okay, so since it takes 40 days,
yes.
Since it takes 40 days and $3 million to repair a single cable, does D&D have a company on retainer to mend undersea cables on call, on demand?
I'm not aware of a company. Mr. Chair, I don't know whether we have a contract in existence to do that. There are a number of Canadian companies that we can work with in the event of both an accidental or a targeted event targeting our undersea cable networks.
Does the CAF have the personnel and the equipment necessary to do the undersea cable repair itself?
Mr. Chair, that is not currently an autonomous capability that the Canadian Armed Forces has. It does speak to the growing relationship between defense and whole of society, as well as Canadian industry, which we're working hard to strengthen those ties. We are also exploring and expanding, ever present, our capability for surveillance from seafloor to space.
So I'm going to pass it on now to Mrs. Lapointe, please.
Le Président. Major General, I had the opportunity to go to the Baltic regions last year, where we went to Latvia, and I did get to meet some of our Canadian Armed Force members there. It's an impressive brigade that I believe now numbers close to 2,000 members. So on that, how effective has Canada's contribution to Operations Reassurance in Latvia been in deterring Russian aggression?
Mr. Chair, thank you for that question. The Canadian Armed Forces has been leading in Europe since 2015, when our presence first got there 10 years ago. We stepped up as one of the 4 first lead framework nations for a battle group in 2017. In 2022, in response to the invasion, the Canadian Armed Forces stood up again from battle group to brigade. The number of 2,200 accurate. We do surge on that mission when you combine the land forces in Latvia with the air and the maritime contributions, and they peak episodically around 3,000. We have been resolute in our support for NATO-led deterrence and defense. And concurrently, Canadian Armed Forces are strengthening relationships with the 13 allies with whom we're partnered, including our gracious hosts in Latvia.
Thank you. Mr. Curran, in terms of the Euro-Atlantic region, what do you see as both the challenges and the opportunities that exist for Canada to specialize in areas like cyber defense or Arctic security that can contribute meaningfully to Arctic defense?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think one of the most exciting opportunities, I think, speaks to as well one of our most significant challenges, which is investments that are required in the defense industrial base. We recognize our ability to resupply the forces, to ensure that we have the ammunition, the spare parts available for the type of fight that we are trying to deter. Requires significant investments. And that's part of the reason why we're working with the European Union on defense-related issues, and we're trying to grow our relationship there. I would say as well, when we think about the work that we do in the Arctic, it's often expeditionary in nature, even for Canada. The distances are extreme. The weather can be incredibly difficult. And so those same capabilities that we develop for the Arctic can help us in force projection in a European theater. And so I think that's complementary. And we also have to, we recognize as well that a conflict that could break out in Europe with NATO allies would not be limited to the European theater. And the very likelihood of threats through the Arctic is something that we need to focus on. And it's a reason it was a priority in the recently updated defense policy, Our North Strong and Free.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I might add, there's a reflex at times to see adversaries in specific regions, but the adversaries are global. So the adversary you might be facing in a certain region is the same one in another region. And importantly, NATO is focused on the northwest flank with the Atlantic Ocean, and therefore NATO is very interested in the contributions and the defense of Canada and the collective defense of North America.
Mr. Laporte, so like many Canadians, we have a real concern over the rise of misinformation online, with a big source of these campaigns coming from Russia. Can you tell us how Canada is working with NATO and our European partners to counter that Russian hybrid threats, such as cyber attacks and disinformation?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Canada is very active on the cyber front and on the foreign information manipulation and interference realms. We lead in the G7 what's called the Rapid Response Mechanism, which includes G7 partners, but also the European Union and NATO participants to look in terms of online sources of disinformation, misinformation, to try to correct those and adjust responses. And we're also, that mechanism really looks at open source information, develops skills and tools and capacity building for society and civil society organizations. There's capacity building involved in that to NATO allies, NATO partners, so beyond just NATO allies, and other areas. So Canada is very active in that sphere. That's from a global affairs perspective. I know our Canadian security establishment is also very active in that field, and as is the Canadian Forces Cyber Command.
Okay. Do I have time remaining, sir?
You have another minute.
Okay. A minute. I'm going to ask very quickly then, Major General, from a military readiness perspective, what are some of the Canadian Armed Forces' greatest challenges in meeting simultaneous commitments in Europe and in Indo-Pacific?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So we are seizing the opportunity that's been provided to us by Canadians and the Canadian government for focused investment to expand our readiness. That said, We will see the downstream return on that investment as it materializes over months and years. We currently have the readiness we have based on the investments that have been made to date, and therefore there are fixed forces of which we are working to optimize, but there are choices to be made about how to employ the Canadian Armed Forces based on the global instability that we see around the world.
No,
We'll pass it over to you, Monsieur Savard.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Savard.
Oui, merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, gentlemen, and thank you for your presentations and for your attendance here. Let's focus on the Indo-Pacific for a moment, if you will. The official position today in Canada is recognition of China as a state, led by Beijing in case of a conflict or an attack on Taiwan. What would be Canada's position? And I'm not discussing level of preparedness. I'm talking about our position. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. As you mentioned at the beginning of your question, we have a one China policy. Beijing is the legitimate government administrator of China, but in our policy, we do have access to individual person-to-person exchanges and trade exchanges with Taiwan. In the case of a conflict, I cannot really engage in hypotheticals as to the government of Canada's position on that front. So at this point, there is no deterrence position. There is no current position to say that there will be support for Taiwan in case of a war. If I may, many discussions are underway. There are diplomatic efforts with the Chinese representatives in Beijing. Any kind of armed conflict would be detrimental. Our preference would be to maintain the status quo. And the Canadian Armed Forces are in the region. There is a deterrence effect through that. But as to taking a stance today on what the government would do in the case of a conflict, I'm not in a position to do that today. So there is a disagreement about the idea of a potential attack of China on Taiwan, but there is no clear position yet as to what would happen if that were to occur. There's no desire to have any conflict between China and Taiwan, and that is a position that we have clearly expressed with the Chinese authorities. Next question, and perhaps we can then move to defense as well. Based on what we know, the People's Republic of China is deploying troops in the Taiwan Strait. There have been patrols. Ships have shown some force and to show its military presence. Xi Jinping has called on the People's Liberation Army to have the military capacity to invade Taiwan by 2027. So that would be the objective. By 2027, that means it could be before 2027, and, you need to be ready, said the leader. Based on the information you have, is this a serious threat or not? Thank you for your question, Mr. Chair. I'd start by saying this. China is currently professionalizing its capacity. By 2049, its goal is to be a world-class military. Second, by 2027, that's the same date that was announced, which we are closely looking at within the forces. We're seeing an increase in activity within China in all areas, and they are starting to normalize their actions, meaning it would be more and more difficult to have any indication of attacks on Taiwan because their activities are growing in the region in intensity, for more so than ever before. So there's it's growing in intensity, I understand, but there's some lack of clarity here. They're increasing their activities in the region, but it doesn't mean there is a will to invade. Am I understanding more or less? Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, it is true. It is about a level of preparedness, but we don't know what the will is to take action. We're working with our partners and our allies to better prepare the Canadian Armed Forces for all circumstances with respect to conflicts throughout the world. It is true. China is preparing, and by 2027. Mr. Chair, as my colleagues have mentioned, the warning options are shortening, if you will. We're trying to maintain the status quo. What we're noticing is that the Chinese, in their operations and their exercises and tactics, they themselves are changing the status quo. The status quo is changing, and we're drawing their attention to this. They're actually changing things. So you can confirm that's happening. People are aware of this. Mr. Laporte may be in a better position to answer, but if you do have anything to add, don't hesitate. I saw that you were on the trade side of foreign affairs. How technologically dependent is the Chinese army for certain things like buses, engines, etc.? Is Canada, through its trade, strengthening the Chinese army? I work at GAC on the political side, not so much on the trade side. I don't have an answer to that specific question, but we do have a system for export controls that involves looking at Canadian goods that are sold abroad. We always analyze the impact of what is being sold in terms of through a lens of through several lenses. And when it comes to exports, there's also defense that looks at national security interests, and I think you can say, as you were saying, that there is some awareness now that Canadian components that are sold abroad should not be directed towards these Chinese forces.
So as you can just note, we kind of went into panel 2 just now, which is fine if the committee is okay with that. We can just sort of have a free-for-all. Mr. Savard, thank you so much. I am now going to pass it over to Mr. Jeff Kibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, for the witnesses, I'm looking to explore some capability and threats that our CAF personnel are faced deployed in Latvia. Thank you, General Ritchie, for your service. Could you tell me how many troops we have there right now?
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So the exact number I will pull up, but we fluctuate around 2,200. The number, as I mentioned, maxes out at 3,000 through the episodic commitments of both air and maritime. Presently, we have our air contribution both in Latvia and in Prestwick. As well, we have 3 ships currently contributed to NATO, and therefore we're on the higher end of 2,500, but we do hit 3,000 from time to time.
Thank you. And that 3,000 then is including the ships that are there, or is it just 2,200 approximately on the ground in Latvia?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So in Latvia, 2,200 is an accurate approximation.
Thank you. I recently visited CFB Edmonton, and I heard about some of the challenges they're facing there. Can you briefly tell me the cycle, the timeline of the cycle for force generation, then their deployment, and then their return, regroup, resting?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So historically, readiness models have involved 3 phases: preparation for, the deployment and execution of a mission, and then the recovery and the reconstitution of the force. That has changed for Latvia specifically, where we've moved the force generation training out of Wainwright, Alberta, where it was conducted previously. It is now being done alongside those 13 allies in Latvia with the host nation. We are continuing to assess the duration of the deployments, which will condition the preparation and the recovery time based on the cumulative demand for the Canadian Armed Forces to make sure that we can maximize our contribution to the nation while still supporting our people.
Thank you. Would it be fair to say then that cycle has been compressed over since the deployment began?
Mr. Chair, so the cycle continues to be optimized, and as there's changes in theater, both in Europe as well as support to the Ukrainian armed forces, there are adjustments to the cycles. I can't speak to whether a specific group may have had a slightly adjusted schedule.
Thank you. You mentioned extension of 3 years. Based on the troops and the information that I've heard from the base in Edmonton, do you assess this as a challenge for the CAF to maintain this cycle for another 3 years?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. It is indeed our most significant contribution is Operation Reassurance, and for the Canadian Army, the focal point is our commitment to Latvia. At present, we are sustaining our contribution, but it is alongside other emerging global instability. And as we consider potential increases in Latvia, we'll have to do that with a clear mind to other challenges and the choice space that presents.
Thank you. I've heard official statements saying that adding troops to Ukraine based on potential security agreements and guarantees is a possibility being looked at in the future. Will that potential new commitment impact the capability of the approximately 2,200 personnel on the ground in Latvia?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So this is indeed a global challenge with the fixed forces that we have. At present, we are resolute in our commitment to Latvia, and we see that being unchanged. That said, we are working in collaboration with allies led by the UK and France on the Coalition of the Willing to examine possibilities for fourth generation of elements across 30 contributing nations to assist in a just peace for Ukraine should a ceasefire be reached.
Thank you very much. And I would like to ask if specifically for Canada, because you referred to other allies, but specifically for Canada, are we going to be able to maintain the approximate 2,000 in Latvia concurrent to a potential commitment in Ukraine?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yes, we can maintain the current contribution to Operation Reassurance in Latvia, but it is absolutely informing our capacity to contribute to an expanded mission in Ukraine should the Coalition of the Willing deploy forces on the eve of a ceasefire agreement that may be reached.
Thank you. And you mentioned pre-deployment.
Time is up. We have 5 minutes. Just for the benefit of the witnesses, there is a second round, a second panel, which is going to be dealing with the Asia Pacific, and there will be opening remarks by the witnesses. So if we can try to concentrate on the Euro-Atlantic region during this round, during this panel, to enable.
Si je peux me permettre, Monsieur le Président, est-ce qu'on peut pas des questions comme bon nous semble, si on en a.
Mr. Chair, can we not sort of make that decision ourselves if we have more questions about the Indo-Pacific? Are you suggesting that we not ask?
For the benefit of the witnesses, that's all. Because they came prepared for 2 different panels and they have opening remarks in the second panel. By all means, the members are free to ask whatever they wish. I'm just asking us to be courteous to the witnesses because of what they have prepared before us.
Are well prepared on both issues and can handle them. It's the same panel for both hearings, and so I think that
I leave it to the members to decide how they want to proceed. The members can decide how they want to proceed. I'm just being cognizant of the witnesses and the second panel, which they will be given an opportunity to have an opening panel. Oh, they're very capable, absolutely. My next, over to you, Chris Mallett. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you.
They push it for you.
Yeah, okay. I'm used to being on Belleville City Council, so we push our own. Thank you very much. Through you, Mr. Chair, this summer, Minister McGuinty and Prime Minister Carney, it's early, We're in Brussels to sign a new deal with European Union states regarding defense procurement, among other things. And I guess my question is to Mr. Curran. Can you tell us more about how Canada is forging new partnerships with EU member states to support Ukraine?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. What I'll do is I'll turn to my colleague from GAC, and then I can provide some additional comments.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, indeed. This summer, the Prime Minister, Minister McGuinty, and Minister Anand signed a security and defense partnership with the European Union. That is a partnership that includes work on support to Ukraine, crisis management, cybersecurity, countering hybrid threats, arms control, space security, AI, emerging technologies, enhancing defense industrial cooperation. A big part of that is going to be the defense industrial cooperation. In addition to this security and defense partnership, my colleagues are engaged in, will be engaged in negotiations with the European Union to access Safe Security Action for Europe, or REARM 2030, which, that is a European Union defense plan that has two components. One is up to 650 billion euros in deficit spending allowances for EU member states. That is not what we're trying to be. This is simply the rules that govern the EU members. But there's 150 billion of that is sort of a loan program for defense spending to allow European Union member states to access funds and resources to increase their defense capabilities. So we are negotiating, or we will be negotiating soon with the EU, an agreement to have Canadian firms have access to that pool to be sort of seen as potential bidders and competitors to support the EU.
Mr. Chair, if I could just add, our work with the EU is also important from a defense point of view, in the sense that the EU is very helpful when it comes to things like logistics support, military mobility, working together on advanced technologies. And so we're very proud to work with them through the PESCO projects, the Permanent Structured Cooperation projects, because a lot of the how we fight is predicated on how we get there as well, and the EU can be very helpful from that point of view.
And if I can add one more thing that I should have mentioned, yes, we are forging this partnership with the EU, but at the same time, that doesn't change the fact that NATO remains the core guarantor of transatlantic security, and that is recognized by all European allies.
Yes, and further to that, if I may, I guess to Mr. Lapointe as well, as we've seen Canada evolve in our activities in Europe, particularly in our training in Latvia, in the overall scheme of our relationship with the EU and the united front that we're showing, coalition of the willing, as it's been called, is Canada carved out its particular role in that respect?
Well, maybe I can start to answer and then turn it over to Mr. Kern or General Ritchie. I mean, we. Again, we've signed this sort of security and defense partnership with the EU. We have a long-standing relationship with a lot of European allies. We have a commitment to Latvia, which is recognized amongst European allies as sort of a really well done deployment, one that is very multinational and is able to bring in more allies than other similar deployments. And we're also recognized as a very sort of strong in sort of supporter of Ukraine, including in the training sphere, but including also in the capacity development. So I think there is a recognition of Canadian continued interest and contribution to Euro-Atlantic European security. And maybe I could turn over to colleagues if they have anything to add.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just perhaps to add a little bit of color to the coalition of the willing. So that is distinct from the EU that has been referenced. This is a conglomerate of nations, 30 at this time, that are like-minded in protecting Ukraine, rebuilding the Ukrainian armed forces, deterring Russia, and defending values and Europe. The discussions are happening at the political level. Our Prime Minister and our Minister of Defense have participated. There's also cascading discussions that are happening at the strategic military and operational military levels. There's an operational headquarters being led by the UK and France in Paris, to which the 30 nations have the opportunity to embed planners and liaison officers to develop robust implementation plans if a ceasefire is reached in Ukraine that could see the potential deployment voluntary of these coalition of the willing member states. Importantly, that would not be a NATO mission at this time. It would have no Article 5 guarantee in its current construct.
Thank you, Mr. Mallet. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay, over to you. You have 5 minutes.
Oui, alors, monsieur.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to be good and actually get the answers I want also. Let's do both at the same time. The sanctions against Russia, I would imagine it's up to you perhaps more in your line of questioning, but those sanctions against Russia, even though it's of course necessary, it's what is required in this type of attack, but we've seen situations where on the one hand, with respect to the EU, we saw that they had this energy dependence, and then India decided to buy Russian oil and sell it. And then people say, well, you buy it from India rather than Russia. It ends up costing more. Certain people are profiting. So everyone except for Europe, everyone else seems thrilled. It doesn't change anything for Russia. Because of the sanctions, China has essentially accessed the Russian economy. It's had this effect on the geostrategic bloc of Brexit, or the cooperation agreement for Shanghai. So we've seen this happen, and if I'm not mistaken, yuan is the currency of choice after their own currency in Russia. So what's the solution in this context if sanctions aren't working? You're absolutely right to draw a link between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic, as you say. As you mentioned, Europe, we, the U.S., and other countries have put sanctions in place as to a price cap for oil. That is the price at which Russia can sell its oil. It's far lower, so they have fewer profits, but they're still selling it. So there are discussions underway among ministers of finance to see how we can manage to reduce Russia's capacity to have access to oil revenue. One of the consequences of the Ukraine war, as far as I'm concerned, and it's harmful to Russia over time, is that it is increasingly dependent on China. This China-Russian relationship means that Russia is a junior partner. And I think over the long term, some elite Russian authorities are wondering if it was the right move. There is some reluctance there. One of the things we're looking at closely, and that is concerning, is what's happening between Russia and North Korea. This is now an important partner for Russia in its conflict in Ukraine, given the soldiers that were sent to the front, North Korean soldiers, that is, ballistic missiles and other munitions. This is one other outcome. The theaters, as Mr. Curran was saying earlier, the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific theaters are increasingly integrated. And if there is a conflict in Europe with Russia, there could also still be a conflict with China elsewhere.
Very relevant questions. I'm allowing a little extra time for the responses, so it does go a bit over time, but I do want to try to keep us on track. I am now over to Mr. Scott Anderson. And you got 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Can you explain why Canada is not pre-deployment training in Canada?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair. So in terms of the training, if we're speaking about Operation Reassurance in Latvia, it was historically done in Wainwright, where we had instrumentation support That said, we would be doing so unilaterally as Canadians. It's not realistic for our 13-member NATO nations to return to Wainwright, Alberta. Additionally, we need to plug that within higher organizations, so a multinational division and a core, which would be offset in time. And then ultimately, there is a deterrence effect by virtue of conducting the training in location on the front line for which the multinational group is defending. So those conglomerate of reasons have led us to the decision to move the pre-deployment training to Latvia, which was exceptionally well received by Latvia and all the allies.
Okay. I know historically...
You don't have to do anything to do it.
I know historically there have been multinational training in Canada. Is it because of a lack of equipment that we're not doing it here?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So it's not because of a lack of equipment, but as this group would acknowledge, that commitment of 2,200 individuals has over 400 vehicle types that are deployed to Latvia. That required 3 container ships to send all that equipment over to Europe, and therefore we don't have those extra 400 vehicles, nor is that required. The vehicles that the individuals are using for that deployment are the ones that they need to conduct the pre-deployment training on so that they understand the systems and have the trust and confidence in using that equipment.
Okay, so we don't have the redundancy then here.
So 400 vehicles are currently, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, 400 vehicles are currently deployed for the support of Latvia. We do not have a mirror complement of that equipment in Canada, nor is it required. And ultimately, the pre-deployment training has more benefits for more members of the alliance if conducted forward.
Thank you. Can you explain to us, not whoever is best, explain to us for the benefit of Canadians why, I think Canadians understand why we're supporting NATO. I'm not sure some Canadians understand why we are sending $6.5 billion to a non-NATO nation. Can you explain for the benefit of Canadians why we are doing that?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Mr. Chair, sorry. I mean, if Canadians understand the importance of NATO, it's our collective security. I think what we're also seeing, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, illegitimate and illegal invasion of Ukraine, it has basically broken a peace that has stood in Europe since the Second World War, and it is basically attacking the values that Canadians stand for in terms of democracy, rule of law, and if Ukraine fails, then you have another the signal that it sends to not only to Russia but to other adversaries that you can survive with might can win over anything, and so therefore that is why Europeans have taken on sort of a lead in wanting to provide assistance to Ukraine, to protect Ukraine, to defend Ukraine, and from a Canadian perspective, that is the right thing to do. That is sort of protecting out there sort of our values and our norms à distance, if I can put it that way, and that's why we are also, as Canadians and the government of Canada, have been committed to supporting Ukraine.
I completely understand the sovereignty argument, and I completely agree with it. However, I mean, we've got warfare elsewhere. The DRC, for instance, 6 million people killed. Why Ukraine? Why is it in Canada's national interest to help Ukraine and not elsewhere?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Again, this is a conflict that is happening on the border of NATO. We're a member of NATO. NATO allies are extremely concerned about the implications of failure to support or defend Ukraine in this context, and there are potentially downstream implications. Again, not only for Russia and what Russia might want to do vis-a-vis NATO in the future, should it win in Ukraine. I think it'll feel emboldened, but also what other adversaries are seeing in terms of the response from the West. Think of China, for example. Think of Iran. Think of South Korea in terms of how they would see a Western response to Ukraine that is insufficient.
Thank you very much. With regard to this is the first time in this century that we've seen modern symmetrical warfare using mainly weapons that are 21st century vintage, and it's not what we thought. We thought it would be short and sweet and over quickly. It has turned out that weight does actually matter. What lessons has Canada learned from that conflict?
Let's put it in your back pocket so that we can respond, but your time is up, so we have to go on to the next. So over to you, Mr. Watchorn. You have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour le temps.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the time. Thank you, gentlemen, for answering our questions. This week, we noted that Russia had drones sent over Polish airspace. I'd like to hear what this means to you. In what way does that cause the threat level to rise and affect the conflict? Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yes, indeed. On September 10th, Russia violated the sovereignty of Poland with approximately 24 drones over its airspace. There were some drones among those 24 that went over Belarus. NATO responded decisively with fighter planes that left the Netherlands and Poland. Italy was also involved. At least 3 of these drones were shot down by NATO. Poland found at least 14 of these drones on their landmass, and we note that there were no injuries, and no deaths due to these drone incursions. Also, we saw something similar in Romania happen with a single drone. Again, 4 fighters replied to that threat. That was fighters from Romania and Germany. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As the Major General said, NATO responded quickly and effectively with fighter planes. The following day, they held a North Atlantic Council meeting on Article 4. In other words, Poland felt threatened and wanted to state to its allies that it needed help, and it also was a signal to the adversary that they went further than they should have, and we saw a quick response from NATO establishing what's called the Eastern Sentry, meaning the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander, could take forces elsewhere and bring them to the eastern flank to protect the airspace. And so a coordinated, rapid, and determined response. Thank you for your answer. Further on this, what would be Canada's contribution if this were to recur? Let's say Russia violates the airspace of other NATO partners. How can Canada contribute to counter that? Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We're currently working with our colleagues at NATO. Staff within the SACEUR's office are looking at options to strengthen air defense and also to build capacity in order to use drones and the capacity in Poland at defense. We're looking at the options of managing forces in this way. We are formalizing this analysis, and we'll be presenting it to our superiors. Thank you. On the issue of drones, conflict in Europe seems to involve drones far more so than we expected, and with a surprising level of effectiveness. Is Canada well enough equipped when it comes to drones in order to engage in these kinds of missions? Mr. Chair, I could discuss drone technology before handing over the floor to my colleagues. To start, Russia signified an increase in production of domestic drones. Over the last 6 months, 3 things have changed. First, the payload, or in other words, what the drone can carry, has gone from 50 to 90 kilograms of payload potential. That's almost 2x. It can also carry various different types of warhead, fragmentation, thermobaric, explosive. And third, these drones are more and more capable of countering electronic warfare or resisting electronic warfare. Given the issue of lessons learned, drones are becoming an important part of this warfare. It's important to make investments so that we can have the useful types of drones that the Canadian Armed Forces can work with. That's why we work with Ukraine, to really gain from their lessons learned, their technology, and perhaps so that we can equip the forces with drones that would be combat capable in these kinds of circumstances, where we have electronic countermeasures and you take into consideration all of the things that have been learned by Ukraine over the course of this war.
Mindful of the time, we are into round 3. I would like Mr. Bazin and Sherry DeNova to have their say, but given the time that I've taken away from Mr. Simone, I was wondering if it's okay if I have an additional 2.5 minutes. Is the members okay to allow the bloc to add an additional question for this last round? Okay. To you, Mr. Bazin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just thank our witnesses for being here. Want to just follow up again, going back to the question of the NATO certification of Canadian troops with their allies in Latvia. It was reported by CBC that a large number of our personnel were unable to participate in that certification exercise because of a large number of vehicles. You said there's 400 vehicles there, but a bunch of them were not in service and unable to be used in that training exercise. Can you speak to why that happened?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So inside the Department of Defense, we have what we call national procurement, and that is the characterization of funds that go to the sustainment of fleets of equipment, including vehicles. I would declare that the recent budget commitment has enabled major spare parts orders delivery, and we have undertaken that at speed. That said, the lack of past resourcing eroded a couple of things. First of all, the reserve stock that we had on the shelves of spare parts to sustain these fleets, as well as some of our long-standing suppliers, pivoted to other contracts, given that we'd had periods of time without contract. Time is required for industry to ramp up to need. In the specific case that was mentioned, tanks were at issue. Tanks, importantly, are an aging platform. They're facing obsolescence in the current variant that we have. It is not unique to Canada. The allies that are also using the Leopard tank have encountered the same shortfalls, and the war in Ukraine has intensified global demand against fixed production, and in some cases...
How many tanks were not available for that training exercise then? And if that is an issue in Latvia for us, is that meaning that our tanks that are here for training on, like at Edmonton and elsewhere, are unable to be used for training at this moment as well?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So of the 400 vehicles that are in Latvia, 17 of them have a Leopard tank chassis, 15 of them are main battle tanks, and 2 of them are armored recovery vehicles. Indeed, that fleet, I don't have the exact number of the 17 that were not up, that fleet is under duress as we're working with allies in Germany who generate. And I would just add that we always have to balance the global fleet demands. So while we privilege op reassurance for the reasons that are obvious to this table, there are other theaters that may require said capabilities, and we need to make sure that we're balancing domestic readiness with international readiness in different theaters.
Okay, I appreciate that. Let's get back to the incursion of Russian drones in Polish and Romanian airspace. Definitely the swarm that came into Poland seemed to, weren't there by accident, weren't just testing airspace like we saw in Romania, which was just a fly-through. And you mentioned that Belarus was one of the destinations of where they were potentially launched from, if not flown over. What was the target in Poland? What were they going after? Was it material and supply lines for Ukraine that are originating out of Poland?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So up front, we don't have a conclusive confirmation about Russian intent. It is something on the classified level that we're monitoring carefully, both Canadian sources as well as in partnership with allies. We have seen more daring and provocative behavior from Russia. This is all about escalation management. as they look to uncover what is the response of both NATO and states on the border in terms of time and capability and risk management.
Let's talk about escalation of Russia in Ukraine specifically. And you mentioned that they seem to be gaining little ground for a high cost, and we're hearing casualties of over 1 million people already from the Russian side. Tanks, armored vehicles I'm hearing, are quite in a state of disrepair, that the Russians do not have availability, especially of main battle tanks anymore. How is that impacting the rationale of them going more and more to, Syed drones, using more hyperglide missiles and rockets, and attacking further inland than what we witnessed, such as more frequent bombings of Kiev and Lviv and other Ukrainian cities?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So to be sure, as you've inferred, technology has expanded reach, scope, and endurance. We are seeing specifically in drone and missile technology iterative adjustments and iterative responses in defense on both sides of that battle space from which we continue to learn. You also made reference to Russian mobilization challenges, which are a thing. They have 3 times the population of Ukraine. And as you're aware, they've expanded the ranks of the Russian Federation Armed Forces 3 times since 2022, when the war started 3.5 years ago. They have a goal of expanding to 1.5 million individuals, and they are resulting to things like monetary initiatives, propaganda, and coercion to continue to fill their ranks. And they continue to maintain a strategic partnership with North Korea. As this table knows, in November of 2024, 12,000 DPRK soldiers were committed to the Kursk region, and we understand that there may still be north of 10,000 that are in Russian territory along that border.
Thank you, General. Over to you, Ms. Romanado. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. I just want to start off because there were some comments earlier that questioning Canada's participation with Op Reassurance. And as a proud founding member of NATO, it's imperative that people understand that what is happening in Ukraine is a menace to global security. We heard a little bit about Op Reassurance, the fact that we have renewed for 3 years. What will be the impact of that renewal of this operation for NATO's eastern flank, as well as detection and deterrence activities that NATO is leading in the region?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think the extension of our mission is incredibly important to ensure our allies about our long-term commitment to deterrence on the eastern flank. Op Reassurance is the Canadian contribution to that, but all of our allies are deploying forces to the eastern flank to ensure that we are ready and able to deter future Russian aggression. And as we look at this escalation management that my colleague referred to, that we have forces that are ready to further escalate if the situation requires, so as to deter Russian aggression. That reinforcement that all of our allies are doing, I think, is incredibly significant. As I said before, it's the largest upscale in a generation. And it serves, I think, to reassure our allies that the alliance is solid from a unity point of view, that we are in this together, and that the territory of the alliance of all members will be defended, if there are future aggression. And I'll pass to either of my colleagues who may want to jump in, or not.
Unity. So recently, the Prime Minister and the Minister of National Defence announced Canada's additional $2 billion in military assistance from the G7 leaders meeting will go towards critical equipment, drones and electronics, ammunition and military equipment to strengthen air defence support. Can you tell us how these critical investments and tools will help on the ground?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I have the pleasure of managing our military assistance program to Ukraine. I'm very proud of the work that we've done to help ensure that some of those armored vehicles that members have referred to are no longer usable. It's an incredibly challenging space for the Ukrainians. There are, as we already alluded to, significant upticks in ballistic missile attacks and drone attacks. When we speak to the Ukrainians, they've underlined to us consistently the need for more investments in air defense, the need for more investments in artillery shells, the need for more investment in drones. Canada's played a proud part of that. We have recently announced a contribution to a U.S. NATO initiative, the Priority Ukraine Requirement List, which provides urgently needed high-end military equipment for the Ukrainians, including things like Patriot missiles. But we've also been able to make significant investments from Canadian industry to support the work that Ukraine is doing, both from a component point of view, but also from things like armored vehicles, from ammunition, and from other support. So the work that we do is helping Ukraine on the ground every day. We are always keen to do more, but we recognize, the need to make sure the investments that we are making are worthwhile and relevant for Canada and for Ukraine.
And Major General, would you agree that the importance of Canada's presence in the region and the training in the region, as you mentioned, in terms of readiness, is when you mentioned the deterrence in terms of the CRINCs, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, to deter and ensure display of force so that we are not dealing with additional conflict in the region from the CRINCs?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So Canada is a resolute partner to NATO, and we've been leading with strength for that last decade, doing so alongside our 13 allies, as well as the flanks on the multinational brigades. We are seeing the interaction intensifying between adversaries, so China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. They seem to have unique relationships forming with transactional benefits in each circumstance. But to be sure, what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening with NATO on the eastern flank is sending a unified message to those adversaries that we are resolute in our resolve for the deterrence and defense of the partner nations.
Thank you. Do I have a few more moments?
Thank you. No, that's it. Mr. Savard, 2.5 more minutes, and then we'll go on to the next panel.
2 minutes et demie, mon Dieu, ça va passer vite.
2.5 minutes, Mr. Chair. That's only enough time to say hello. So when you were cut off last, I felt like there was something you wanted to add. We were talking about the sanctions, which would strengthen the sort of Europe-Asian situation, also China. We were talking about the circumventing of sanctions by India vis-a-vis the whole oil supply to Europe. No, all that, okay, is good. Okay, well, then let's keep going on this link between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions. In this particular case, the geostrategic buildup. This is perhaps more for Defense Department of the Department of Defense. How do you see these things happen? I mean, there are very complex there's a complex relationships between India and Russia, even in BRICS 2 weeks ago, or recently anyways. Again, Mr. Modi was there and then left the meeting rather quickly. Are there effective results in terms of military cooperation on top of this economic strengthening of ties? Even they're talking about an alternative source of funding. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. And as was mentioned earlier, we're really noticing an increased cooperation between Russia, China, India, Korea, North Korea. There's an intensification of these links, but they each have their own agenda. So it's not an alliance as such. There's more coordination and more links. There are some hybrid links as well, this espionage, this influence, interference tactics exist. They are trying to undermine the status quo for us and our allies. Now, with respect to military cooperation, North Korea has significantly contributed to the conflict in Ukraine, but the Shahed drones from Iran also had a part to play. So this cooperation is increasing. I could hand over the floor to my colleague, perhaps? No?
Go on to the next panel.
I hear the next panel will really be just discussing this issue.
We will now move on to the topic of panel 2, which is the defense and security to the Indo-Pacific region, part 3 in this case, in some cases. And I would now like to invite the officials of DND to deliver the opening remarks. You have 5 minutes, but if you want to spare a few, that'd be great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Given that we've covered some of these, I will condense my remarks as much as possible. As we've just were speaking about with le vice-président, this is an important two topics together because Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic security are interconnected. We look at Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea, who are all NATO partner countries in the region, and our security in the Indo-Pacific directly impacts our security in Europe and here at home. China, as we've already discussed, remains a critical enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine, and military cooperation between North Korea and Russia has deepened, spanning personnel, as General Ritchie raised, but also military tactics and trainings, and importantly, the transfer of technology. As Canada, with our Arctic region straddling Europe and the Pacific, it means that both regions remain crucial for our national security and economic prosperity. La région Indo-Pacifique est confrontée à des nombres.
The Indo-Pacific region faces many challenges: the rise of authoritarian powers threatening democratic norms and principles, diplomatic, economic, and military coercion, the weaponization of trade, and the undermining of human rights and media freedom. Notably, we see China attempting to reshape the international system to create an environment more permissible to its interests. We remain particularly concerned by China's efforts to further militarize the South China Sea, including through the use of naval, coast guard, and maritime militia vessels to intimidate and threaten the ships of other states. These activities challenge long-standing norms and international law and affect the rights of all nations to operate peacefully in international commons, whether at sea or in the air.
I'll just speak briefly to our Indo-Pacific strategy and our current operations, and then open up to questions. So all of this work is achieved through Canada's broader Indo-Pacific strategy, which is led by Foreign Affairs, as well as through the development of defense industrial policies that aim to strengthen, secure, and diversify Canada's defense industrial base. From deploying 3 Canadian Navy ships to the region per year to taking part in Exercise Talisman Sabre recently, which was the largest CAF deployment in a strategic multilateral exercise, national defense continues to deliver our part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. In particular, through Operation Horizon, which is the primary vehicle for our work in the region. Through this, we do things such as our routine transits through the Taiwan Straits, which maintain peaceful and accessible nature of this waterway, which is indispensable to the security and prosperity of the international community. We also work through Operation Neon, which continues to monitor United Nations Security Council resolutions against North Korea, and we maintain our long-standing support to United Nations Command and for the importance of denuclearization and the promotion of peace on the Korean Peninsula. This isn't something that we can do alone, that we have to work very closely with our partners, and it's through that work, I think, that we can continue to promote the values and the important security priorities that we find within the region that have direct impacts on our work here at home. And with that, we welcome your questions.
Thank you for the opening remarks. Ms. Cheryl Gallant, over to you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this year, China's Navy circumnavigated Australia and performed unannounced live-fire exercises outside of its exclusive economic zone. Australia only knew of this because of a commercial pilot flying overhead, detected them first before their Navy or any other allied navies could. What is the threat to Canada and North America should China decide to pull a similar operation by covertly deploying off our shores with their Navy or their dual-purpose vessels?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So first, some quick context. Indeed, Australia and New Zealand involved in that operation, February 2025, the first time ever that a Chinese naval task group circumvented Australia and conducted a live-fire exercise in the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand. All nations in that region, as well as allies, continue to professionalize their all-domain sense capability from seafloor to space. You did identify the dual-purpose vessels. They are problematic. We continue to work across government with all government departments and agencies, as well as all their sensors, to be able to monitor such vessels. We continue to do that in our own Arctic.
Will our Navy respond to an intrusion of the PLA Navy if they were to intrude in Canada's exclusive economic zone off our Pacific coast or in the Arctic?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So as a proud member of the binational command that is NORAD, one of the mission sets of NORAD is maritime domain awareness, and therefore it's an integrated mission set around continental surveillance in the maritime domain. And we have response capability both in the Royal Canadian Navy as well as with the Canadian Coast Guard surveillance and other range of effectors within Department of National Defence and the Government of Canada for calibrated response.
Upon China's invasion of Taiwan, how prepared are our armed forces to mount a massive operation to evacuate our Canadian citizens, permanent residents, or those with connections to Canada to repatriate them?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'll just speak to Canadian Armed Forces global readiness and may defer to colleagues if there's any policy components. We do maintain the standing capability to conduct a non-combatant evacuation operation should such a request come from Global Affairs Canada. That said, this is a unique environment, and if we're talking about post-hostilities breaking out on the island, certainly not that current force that's postured would be suitable for that conflict. We are monitoring the different ranges of ambition of Beijing for potential unification of Taiwan, and I can speak about that if interested.
Okay, well, it's no secret the PRC is trying to claim ownership of the Arctic territory. They've already set up shop, claiming they're doing research. Besides the Rangers, what actual military base has been established in our Arctic, or is Canada working on making Inuvik a full forward operating location with all the necessary infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So first, we do have a permanent presence in the Arctic. That's based on 5,000 Canadian Rangers in 200 communities across the 3 territories. We also have Canadian Forces Station Alert. We also have 440 Squadron in Yellowknife. And then we have an Army presence with the Loyal Edmonton Regiment in Yellowknife. To your question, we had previously maintained 3 forward operating locations in Yellowknife, Inuvik, and Iqaluit. Those 3 locations are being professionalized through the Northern Basing Initiative, and they also happen to have correlation with our Northern Operational Support Hubs.
Where are you in your upgrades? What progress in the forward operating?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So that work is undergoing. The forward operating bases are proceeding ahead of the Northern Operational Support Hubs, but the first 3 Northern Operational Support Hubs are co-located with your question of the forward operating location, because there's great synergies for those to occur in the same locations.
Right. Under what conditions would the Royal Canadian Navy participate in the defense of Japan, the Philippines, or Australia should the PRC mount an attack against any one or all of those countries?
The question. Obviously, we work very closely with our allies, consult and exercise on a regular basis, and the Royal Canadian Navy takes part of that. Again, in the event of a Taiwan scenario or anything else, those are contingency or, I would say, hypothetical at this time, and I'm not prepared to answer questions in terms of what Canada would or could do in those circumstances. Those discussions are certainly ongoing, but I don't want to prejudge any government decision.
Thank you. Time is up for Ms. Glanton, or I shouldn't say that. Time has only just begun. Over to you, Ms. LaPointe. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Cheryl.
Major General, recently the world and certainly the Western perspective watched with some trepidation when China's president hosted Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un at a major military parade. Much has been said about that, but I would be very interested in hearing from your perspective, what is that strategic significance of this trilateral show of alignment? And how should Canada and its allies interpret the signals it sends for global security, particularly in the Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic regions?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So what is clear is that those adversaries have a common intention, and that is to challenge the West and the current rules-based international order. We have been watching this for some time with great interest alongside our allies as we share in the classified domain. On the 3rd of September, we assess that to be a parade showing solidarity and demonstration, but we do not see the sophisticated level of cooperation that might be enjoyed right now alongside NATO partners. But we are carefully watching certain areas where they're transferring technology, resources, drone capability as new and accelerating threats that can present challenges to both NATO and Canada on the continent.
Mr. Curran, you mentioned Operation Horizon, and could you explain the strategic objectives of that operation and how it fits with Canada's defence policy framework, particularly the strong, the secure, and the engaged?
Thank you for the question. Under our defense policy, we identified 3 priority regions. Obviously, Canada and the Arctic and our defense of Canadians is paramount, but we identified Europe and the Indo-Pacific as other priority areas. Under the Indo-Pacific strategy led by GAC, our biggest commitment is through Operation Horizon. It's a bit of a catch-all for a number of activities that we do. Capacity building, training, exercises, as well as the 3 ships that we mentioned. I think the fair criticism of Canada in the past has been that we don't always have an enduring presence in the region. We often come in and dip out depending on other priorities. And so what we've tried to do through Op Horizon is ensure that we have that enduring and sustained presence so we can both ensure that we're picking up on intelligence or information or deepening our relationships in that area so that we can benefit from that experience, but as well as use that experience for the ultimate security of Canada and Canadians.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, if I might be helpful to give a bit of context on the Indo-Pacific strategy as a whole and how the Op Horizon fits into that. So in 2022, the government launched the Indo-Pacific strategy, which is basically $2.3 billion over 5 years that looks at engaging in the region to bolster and diversify our trade, but also enhance our security, and has sort of 5 interconnected strategic objectives: promoting peace, which is what D&D does through Op Horizon, expanding trade, investing, connecting people, building sustainable and green future, and making sure that Canada is active. Why are we engaged in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific? Well, frankly, the region is the fastest growing economic region in the world and accounts for almost 2/3 of global growth. By 2030, it will be home to 2/3 of the global middle class, and by 2040, the region will account for more than half of the global economy. So our Indo-Pacific strategy seeks to advance and defend Canada's interest by supporting a more secure, prosperous, inclusive, and sustainable region, while at the same time protecting Canada's national economic and security at home. And one big element of the strategy is supporting is building and diversifying our partnerships. And since the launch of the strategy, we've reinforced those with Australia, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines as examples.
Okay. Actually, that leads to a question. How is the Department of National Defense approaching cooperation with some of these newer security groupings we're seeing, like AUKUS? Where does, when Canada's not a formal member of those, how are we defining our cooperation in those types of alliances?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. There's a number of international groupings that are out there. Canada is a member of many of them, but not all, of course. We do think there's opportunities when it makes sense for there to be collaboration. There are, when we think of AUKUS, the root of that was nuclear-powered submarines, not an area that we expect Canada to make an investment. But other things on Pillar 2 of the grouping, where we can look at high technology cooperation, we do think there are opportunities to do that either with AUKUS or through partners there. But similarly, there's lots of other organizations out there that we think we can benefit from their experience, even if we aren't members.
Yeah.
If I can add,
Mr. Savard-Tremblay, 5 minutes.
5 minutes cette fois. Merci.
5 minutes, great. So, hello again, gentlemen. Can you tell me about this? Actually, let's get back to what we were discussing. You were discussing a cooperation that is not an alliance between these four players. They each have their own interests. I don't know if you have any highlights, perhaps, to that. Is there anything specific, some factors of perhaps division to note? I addressed this a little earlier. I talked about India. It's a bit of a more complex partner. What can you tell us about this? Many things. If I may, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. As we said, these four countries have different relationships amongst themselves. I would say China probably has a major role to play in all of these links, but they each have independent status. Iran has a strong relationship with Russia when it comes to material cooperation in defense, political support on the nuclear question, also a very strong trade relationship with China on oil. North Korea has a strong relationship with Russia, as we've said, on the military front, but is also a partner with China, a close partner. These are all things we are considering. I'd ask General Ritchie if he has any further examples to share. You asked the question about India specifically. On India, I would say this. There have been long-standing relationships that are quite strong based on mutual... which countries are you referring to? India with whom? Whom with India? We with India. Canada with India, that is. So, a long-standing relationship, the rule of law, other principles. Prime Minister Carney held a bilateral with his counterpart, Mr. Modi, at the G7. And we are trying to recalibrate this relationship. There was an announcement. There are new high commissioners on both sides. So I would put India in a separate category than the other four. Quickly, I summarize this. Between India and China, I say this. It's cold, but it's still a relationship. Would you say the same thing between India and China? They've been at war, in the last couple of decades. Despite what's happening with BRICS and what's happening today, you would say that that's still the case? Yes, I would say. So, based on your summary, India is not a danger in those tectonic plates from an Indo-Pacific standpoint. Now, on the military side. On the military side, thank you for your question, Mr. Chair. To amplify my colleague's comments, from a military standpoint, we've seen technical exchanges, drones, allied defense between Russia and China, Russia and Iran, I would say, actually. And then there are exchanges between North Korea and Russia. That was mostly a human contribution, 12,000 men for the war in Ukraine. And reciprocally, this Russian to North Korea transfer of funds, technology, and experience, which continues to destabilize the peninsula. Okay. How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair?
30 seconds. 30 seconds more.
30 seconds. What can I say that it would be intelligent in the next 30 seconds? Look, 30 seconds. I'll think about the next turn. I don't want to open up an entire other subject. Thank you.
Very well. Mr. Kimball, Jeff Kimball, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to the witnesses. I was just on board HMCS Vancouver, recently returned from Talisman Saver. 6 days ago, we saw a PLAN aircraft carrier, their new one, transit the Taiwan Strait, exercising right of innocent passage. RCN ship did that as well. What's your assessment of PLAN's diplomatic protest for us conducting those operations while they do it concurrently?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Maybe I'll just start with some military characterization and then turn it over to colleagues. Okay, I'll go straight to colleagues, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Yes, we regularly conduct the Canadian Forces, the Royal Canadian Navy regularly conducts transits through the Taiwan Strait. In this particular instance, we did it with the Australians. That's the first time doing it bilaterally with them. And as is the norm, whenever we do transit strait, we often hear from it from our Chinese colleagues, both in Beijing and here. Both also within the Ministry of National Defense, but within Foreign Affairs, they demarche us and sort of explain that we shouldn't be there. We're hyping it up, and we explain that we, through UNCLOS, the law of the sea, we are allowed passage through the strait. It's a strait for international navigation, and so there's nothing preventing us from doing so.
Do you see this as, thank you, them signaling clear intent of what they plan to do in that area?
Thank you for the question. Certainly, it's their intent to try to demonstrate that this is an area that is that they consider to be theirs, and they want to diplomatically register that. There have been times where they also signal that militarily, and maybe I could turn back to colleagues at National Defense in terms of the activities that the Chinese, either the PLA, the Chinese Navy or Air Force do when our forces are in the region.
An aircraft carrier, their new ones, there's certainly a strategic power projection platform. They're doing sea trials right now. Have they successfully launched and recovered aircraft yet, proven that capability?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So Canada does not have in its inventory, as you know, with your previous service, an aircraft carrier, but we often participate in multinational coalitions like the HIMARS series that was led by the UK, for which our most recent Ville de Quebec participated alongside.
State my question if I can. Has the PLAN aircraft carrier proven the capability to launch and recover aircraft?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. The information that I'm aware of is at a classified domain, and I'm happy to share that with colleagues in that form.
Thank you. And I was going to ask, we've seen up to 5, you mentioned the dual-purpose vessels. We've seen up to 5 PLAN AGIs in our Arctic, very close to our shore. And can our Coast Guard counter this threat? What capability do they have beyond navigation radars to intercept comms, track these vessels, and figure out what they're up to and keep track of them?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think while we've always worked very closely with the Coast Guard, I think the integration of the Coast Guard as a special operating agency as part of the Department of National Defense is going to allow us to work more closely together and benefit from the experience that they have. When we think about countering threats, it's not just about the Coast Guard, obviously. It's also about what the Royal Canadian Navy and Armed Forces can do. And I think together, that is how we seek to deter those sorts of threats, both through surveillance and through active operations.
Mr. Chair, I might just add there have been 15 Chinese Arctic expeditions since 1999. Since 2015, we've seen patrols in the subarctic in both the Bering and the Baltic Seas. And to your point, from 2023 to present, we've seen it go from 1 to 3 to 5. So we continue to actively monitor.
Thank you.
Mr. Mallett, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Getting back to, I believe Mr. Curran was describing some of our activities in the Indo-Pacific region, and specifically just returning to the biannual exercise of Op Talisman Sabre. That exercise involved how many CAF members, and did it? Can you maybe quantify how that tested, I guess, our resilience to remain enduring and sustainable in that region? Because as we've heard earlier, we are quite well committed to Eastern Europe, and we're a global way. Does this exemplify our ability to operate at numbers in two distant theaters, I guess?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Short answer is yes. Some additional detail. So it was a multinational warfighting exercise for 3 weeks, 13 July to 4 August, hosted by Australia. 43,000 members of the interested community, 19 nations. Canadian Armed Forces deployed 600 individuals across all domains and all services. That involved both sea, land, air, and special operations forces, 1 ship, 4 aircraft, and it's the largest Canadian Armed Forces deployment in the region since the commencement of Operation Horizon in 2022. Final point would be, you asked a question about sustainability. With tremendous support from Australia, we were able to strategically rearm the Ville de Quebec with its missiles. So although the missiles were projected from Canada, which was significant, with their assistance, we were able to rearm forward and be prepared for operational endurance in that region.
Thank you.
Monsieur Sylvain Tremblay, over to you. Give you 2.5 minutes.
Je souhaiterais également.
I'd like to get back to this question I'd asked Mr. Laporte about the risk of supplying the Chinese army with additional technology. You said there's a good screening process, but we know that the Chinese regime is quite integrated. The major businesses, the Communist Party, the army, everything is a bit incestuous. It's almost like one single entity. In trade, in the area of high technology, how do we know it and doesn't end up in the arms of the Chinese army? Thank you for the question. Actually, you mentioned the fact that in China, the link between the private and public sector, if you will, doesn't exist. Many businesses are state-owned, and Chinese companies are engage in obfuscation. In other words, with respect to their ownership through other shell companies. When the department looks at export controls, we always analyze the entire chain leading to this particular company to get to the source and to see where the components will end up. And there is always a risk, the idea that things could be misused. Are we 100% right? I don't know. Of course, there's always the potential that a component could end up in Chinese military technology. But we really do closely look at ensuring that Canadian components don't end up in Chinese army hands. So let's say an SME from Canada decides to send some chips to some other Chinese company, for instance, some small business. That will be checked? Yes, there are some chips that are going to be looked at closely, others less so. I'm not an expert in the field, but that's what I know so far.
I'm going to Scott Anderson now for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. The Coast Guard is a civilian organization and it's being moved under the umbrella of DND. Is the movement of that budget under DND umbrella, is that going to be figured in the 2% increase or commitment to NATO?
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the question. Yes, I can confirm that the budget of the Department of National Defense counts towards 2%, or counts towards NATO spending.
2%. Good. Yeah, the Coast Guard.
Which would now be part of the
okay.
budget.
Can you tell me what the Coast Guard budget is?
I do not have that. Thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker. That's not a fact that I have in front of me. I'll just
okay, fair enough. At the same time, we're building several new ships for the Coast Guard. They're in production, and they began production before the current strategy appeared. Are any modifications being made to those ships to increase their lethality? We've talked about monitoring the Arctic. We haven't talked about what we're going to actually do about the Arctic.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So at present, there are no plans to militarize the Coast Guard or to incorporate a law enforcement role. The current status is they have 120 vessels in their fleet. That said, there is proposed mandate via the Strong Borders Act, as this group knows, an amendment under the Oceans Act that could strengthen sovereignty and maritime domain awareness, particularly in the remote Arctic waters, and could also enable the CCG, if passed, to conduct security patrols and collect, analyze, and receive and share information and intelligence for security purposes, which is not currently in their mandate, for which we would benefit. Final comment is you may...
Fair enough. Sorry to interrupt you. The problem is these are now warships. These are going to be warships. They're legitimate targets for foreign ships, but they've got no defense capability that I see. Is that not a concern to the Canadian forces?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So the Canadian Armed Forces has a range of capabilities that serve different purposes. It's a systems of systems approach. And when we deploy a capability, certain elements will be focused on detection and surveillance. Other ones may be effective with a kinetic capacity. And then we'll have others that are focused on the protection and sustainment of the force. So we would deploy assets in an integrated fashion.
Sorry, when you deploy the Coast Guard, then you will be deploying the Canadian Navy with it?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So I was speaking conceptually, not in all instances.
Practically, though.
Practically speaking, I can say that the Canadian Armed Forces will be working operationally with the Coast Guard. In certain instances, we will be deployed independently. In other instances, our capabilities will be collaborative and additive, and there will be circumstances in which elements of the Department of Defense, including the Coast Guard, will deploy alongside of each other for integrated outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Just to switch gears a little bit here, we're talking about the lessons learned from modern symmetrical warfare. Is the Canadian military actually pivoting to incorporate some of those lessons? Specifically, armor seems to be to modern symmetrical warfare what cavalry was to blitzkrieg. It seems to be not even be operational on the Ukraine front lines at the moment. Ukraine is using them for medium-range artillery. Russia's got them all blown up. So are we pivoting our forces to reflect the realities of modern symmetrical warfare?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Speaker. Part of the benefit of having our troops that we have deployed in Europe is that we can actively benefit from the lessons learned that are happening in Ukraine, and we can take that back into the force development process that we have so that we can learn those lessons and incorporate them into our training. And so I'm happy to turn over to the DOS if there's anything to add.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So we're indeed monitoring with great anticipation technological developments on the battle space, particularly in the areas of uncrewed systems, not just drones, but also in the maritime and subsurface domains, looking to capitalize on the use of artificial intelligence to move humans up the value chain and to make quicker decisions at speed and outpace the adversary.
And is that both tactical and strategic drone warfare?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So indeed, with the defense industrial nexus, we see this both in terms of AI at the strategic level, in terms of decision advantage, and at the tactical level in terms of the employment of these technologies.
And at the unit level, are we training tactical drone?
If I may.
Oh, sorry.
Your time is over. Mr. Watchorn, 4 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Moi, j'aimerais continuer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to continue on the issue of equipment for a moment. The Government of Canada will be massively investing in acquiring submarines and vessels for defense. How will those tools be used in the Indo-Pacific theater?
Chair, so our currently policy provides for a near persistent. Merci pour la question, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our policy today requires that we have persistent presence in the region. In other words, we have those 3 vessels, and as soon as those capacities are integrated in the forces, we'll see if there will be a change in the policy, but it will give us more options. At the same time, we need to maintain our sea capacity with respect to the defense of Canada and the continental defense. if I may, investments in these vessels and submarines are because we have an aging fleet, there are worsening threats, and it's important to have up-to-date equipment that can contribute, that can engage in operations that are trickier than we might have expected when these equipments were first, when these capabilities were first built. Thank you very much. We know that in the Indo-Pacific theater there are several conflicts ongoing. There's China, Taiwan, Myanmar, India, Pakistan. I'd like your understanding of what is most imminent in the theater. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excellent question. You raise the conflicts and tensions that are ongoing in the theater. There is one conflict or one region, certainly from the perspective of GAC, that is concerning to us, the tensions in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines specifically, but China and other countries as well that are abutting the sea. So we see on a daily basis over 200 Chinese ships, like Coast Guard, maritime militia, etc., in the regions. And recently, we've noted incidents where there were vessels that struck. There was air cannons, etc. So that's a hot spot that we are looking at, and where there is potential for escalating violence on top of what you mentioned. Thank you very much. In closing, there are regional fora in the Indo-Pacific, like the Shangri-La dialogue. Do you think it's productive in terms of cooperation, international cooperation over there? Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Yes. There are a number of groups and fora in the region that are of note. Shangri-La is a conference, but Canada, we are a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum, involving a number of regional countries and partners outside of the region. The ASEAN Regional Forum really seeks to advance discussions to maintain peace and security in the region. Canada is also a member of, as an observer, of ADMM, ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus group. So there you have the Department of the Canadian Department of Defense that is an observer, and it promotes dialogue between all countries, including countries outside of the actual region. So it's useful.
To our last round of this panel. Over to you, James, for 4 minutes.
Thank you. Just want to, Mr. Curran, you mentioned that the Canadian Coast Guard budget is now going to be allocated in its entirety under the Department of National Defense.
Thank you for the question. Just so there's no confusion, so the Canadian Coast Guard will remain a special operating agency under the Deputy Minister of Defense, and so will maintain its budget independent of the Department of National Defense. But what I was trying to say, perhaps poorly, was that that commitment would count towards our NATO target.
Higher NATO budget, or NATO matrix would say the entire Coast Guard budget is part of our 2%. So is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, it would.
Mr. Speaker, okay, I got a promotion. Okay. Mr. But so we're going to get all the dollars without any defense capability, because the science vessels are in there, the commercial navigation, commercial ice breaking, there's a number of things that they do, but we actually don't get any kinetic power from that to help the Canadian Armed Forces in protecting Canada.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So if the proposed mandate is approved with the change to the Act, sovereignty will indeed be strengthened. We'll have enhanced maritime domain awareness and integrated recognized maritime picture.
Out there for the last 100 years and never ever counted towards being part of our national defense matrix. So if it hasn't had the capability, it definitely isn't a paramilitary organization. It doesn't have the interdiction capabilities. They can't even, fine anyone for a fishing violation. They have to bring on fisheries officers to do that. So how can we just can't have creative accounting to get 2%? We actually need capability to protect Canada and our sovereignty.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So if the mandate is adjusted to reflect the onboarding of Canadian Coast Guard inside Defence, we will see an additive output to the intelligence sharing of information and intelligence value that we'll be able to extract from the Canadian Coast Guard. And as the Coast Guard is employed within a systems of systems, we think there will be significant additive effects to surveillance and the defence of Canada.
As long as there's equipment to back that up and actually feeding into the overall security and intelligence gathering systems, then yes. But as it stands today, they don't provide any of that at this point in time. Mr. Laporte, you had also mentioned that every time that Canada sails through the Strait of Taiwan, we're called into the embassy or our foreign service in Beijing gets called in and gets demarched. Do we demarche the Chinese, the Republic of China, or the People's Republic of China, make sure I'm right here, People's Republic of China, when they sail into the Beaufort Sea?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, or Mr. Vice Chair. I'm not aware of any recent démarches of China following Chinese sailing into the Beaufort Sea. Maybe historically we have done it.
Should we?
Perhaps.
Because they're like 250 miles from Yukon and the Northwest Territory border.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Chair. Our economic exclusive zone extends to 200 nautical miles, and so if they're outside of it, they're legitimately allowed. They're also under UNCLOS allowed to go into EEZs of other countries as a normal course of passage.
So I know the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard were monitoring those vessels while they were in our Arctic region. Was there Canadian frigate and or Coast Guard vessels also in the region monitoring, or we did that strictly from Air Force standpoint?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So first, that's one of the mission sets of the NORAD Binational Command, as you know well, and therefore NORAD, both Canadian and U.S. assets. Canadian assets were deployed into the region under a number of different operations. We were monitoring, conducted integrated surveillance and passing intelligence both across the apparatus of Canadian government as well as sharing with U.S. and with NORAD headquarters.
And I do remind others that we're probably going to have a discussion around the Coast Guard in one of our motions put forward by you, and we're going to. You're setting the table. I get it, and I realize that all of us here also know that we just invested another $2 billion just to augment the forces in regards to their pay raise and so forth. I am now going over to Chair Ramonato for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And while I can understand my colleagues across the way voted against the $9.3 billion that we just invested to get to 2%, maybe the frustration is there. But climate change is a real global problem, and it's having a particularly serious effect on our Arctic and northern regions, presenting new and escalating challenges with a range of implications for Canada's security. In Canada's defence policy update, our North Strong and Free is focused on the defence of the Arctic. Can you explain how Canada's work to defend the Arctic is part of defending NATO's northern flank?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's absolutely correct. The Canadian Forces, National Defence, and other entities of the Canadian government are actively engaged in supporting sovereignty and defence of the Arctic. NATO itself, the area of operations of NATO, SACEUR, is sort of continental Europe and into the Atlantic. The Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, is not part of the NATO area of operation. It is sort of part of the NORAD area of operation. That said, everything we do in our Arctic helps to contribute to sort of strengthen and support and defend the sort of north and western flanks of the alliance.
In terms of our maritime awareness, and our NORAD agreement and remodernization of NORAD. Could you elaborate a little bit more on why the investments and getting to the 2% is so important in terms of our continental defense?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So first, we have current capability through the North Warning System and other infrastructure, which is a network of radar stations that was built between 1986 and 1992. As this forum knows well, new and accelerating threats are challenging that antiquated technology, and therefore investments have been made in NORAD modernization, both Arctic over the horizon as well as polar over the horizon. And I would just also say that integrated air and missile defense is exceptionally topical and important. When we talk about visualizing a Canadian continental shield, in the United States, they have the U.S. Golden Dome. Generally speaking, this is a system of systems that allow you to sense, decide, and act to react to incoming threats, which eclipse our North Warning System, but for which the investments made and soon to be realized are going to position us to better deal with those accelerating threats.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to give my remaining time to Mr. Savard-Tremblay because it's very difficult for him to only have 2.5 minutes. Thank you.
Je ne m'attendais pas à avoir
I was not actually expecting more time. How much time?
J'en comprenais. OK, je pensais que vous me laissiez.
I thought you were leaving me part of your... Anyhow. Look, I had a question that I wanted to close off with earlier. It was to know a little bit more about this analysis of goods that are sent. For instance, there are categories of chips. And is that the border services? How does it work? Is it at what point in the process is there a statement as to what the actual goods are that are being exported? Let us understand that without getting into the details. I know you're not an expert on the technology that specifically, but yes, thank you for your question. There are a number of layers to this. When a Canadian company intends to export any good, there's the list of products that we will look at and the countries that we will look at. You have to see if these items are on the list. You have to ask for a special permission from GAC, and then there is an analysis of the product, of the component, and then with national defense and other organizations, including national security organizations, we look into who would be receiving these goods, and then the permit to export can be allowed or denied. As to the country itself, what does it mean in terms of regional security, the idea of making these goods available to another country? There is the national interest, there is human rights. All of these things are factored in. And then there's a border check that is done by our CBSA colleagues. Is that done randomly? I can't tell you that. I don't know. Perhaps the committee would like an explanation of this on our export control side. Yes, that would be a good idea, Mr. Chair. I would imagine that you're going to tell me I have no more time left. Another minute.
Time.
I'll take it. Ça va aller.
I'm fine. Don't worry about me. My problem is how to open something up in a minute that requires much more time than that to address. So you're saying it's looked into, but you're not saying how at the border itself. What I know is that there are many ways of sending goods abroad. It can happen to me. I see that, the exporter, or as myself as an importer, or the exporter says something on the package that is different than what's actually inside. Some people will declare a gift because it's a different category. Do you think there are many goods that fall between the cracks and that there may actually be a serious threat there in terms of security and the People's Liberation Army? Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to answer. If I may, Mr. Chair, add? There was a discussion about hybrid threats earlier. We need a coordinated answer. It's not enough to, let's say, have CBSA. You can't only say it's their responsibility. You have to integrate intelligence from other departments. You have to educate other departments as well. Raise awareness amongst Canadians in general. These threats are prevalent. Through every investigation, it's important to have a coordinated answer to these threats. Not just on the export side. Also, there are a multitude of threats out there.
Thank you all very much to the witnesses. I appreciate your candor and your discussions, and to elaborate further on the issues that are concerning not just this committee, but certainly Canadians and those watching, recognizing that the work that our armed forces does is exceptional, and we really appreciate your service, and we will continue amongst ourselves to try to continue to support the efforts of our armed forces. Folks, our next meeting is going to be either Tuesday or Thursday. I'm trying to arrange the Ombudsman to come on Tuesday to make up for the fact that the Auditor General won't be available under the circumstances. We're now going to be moving, and I'm going to adjourn with your permission so that we can then move into a subcommittee meeting in camera amongst ourselves to determine our priorities as we go forward. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your service and your participation today. Meeting adjourned.